Do you think a single photo could silence the entire United States Senate? Do you believe 1 minute of silence could stop a nation in its tracks? Watch until the very end. Because what you're about to witness isn't just a buried truth. It's a promise kept before a country desperate to believe again. If you believe truth still matters in today's politics, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. Comment your hometown if you've ever felt forgotten, and most importantly, share this video, because sometimes one person standing still is enough to make an entire nation listen. It was supposed to be just another oversight hearing. A midweek session tucked between budget negotiations and committee briefings. One more routine affair where talking heads read numbers off teleprompters and nothing really changed. On the schedule, a review of rural emergency healthcare allocations for fiscal year 2026. Dry, forgettable stuff. But anyone watching that morning at the Capitol could feel as though something was different. The hearing chamber was half full the way it usually is for budget matters. No one expects to trend. Reporters set up casually. Some were checking their phones. The C-SPAN cameras panned lazily across the committee panel. Nothing to see here yet. And then Karoline Leavitt walked in. At 27, she was the youngest press secretary in recent history. White House trained, battle-tested, and carrying more quiet fire than her frame suggested. She wasn't there with a press team, no entourage, just a single leather folder clutched tightly in one hand. She took her seat at the center witness table facing a half-circle of senators. She adjusted the mic once. No notes, just a glance around the room. Across from her sat Senator Adam Schiff. He didn't bother hiding his amusement. Leaned back, legs crossed, pen twirling in his fingers like it was all a game. He knew the cameras were on. He knew his smile was registering. And he knew Karoline would be speaking next. Chairwoman Grace Monroe gave the usual introduction, then gestured toward Karoline. "Ms. Levitt, you may proceed." Karoline leaned in. "Thank you, Madam Chair," she said. Her voice was calm, firm. "I'm here on behalf of the administration to address concerns surrounding delayed federal funding to rural emergency services, specifically the impact of those delays on public health outcomes in counties with populations under 20,000. It was clear, concise, nothing showy. But it didn't take long before she hit a nerve. In counties like Hayfield, East Nolan, and Grayhill, the delay in ambulance funding has directly contributed to emergency response times exceeding 45 minutes. In one case, a 9-year-old girl named Maya Dorsey died on her front lawn. Her mother called 911 3 times. Help never arrived. The room shifted. Karoline continued, measured but unrelenting. "I'm not here to assign blame," she said. "But the American people deserve to understand the human cost of bureaucratic delay. These aren't numbers on a spreadsheet. These are real families, real children." That's when Schiff interrupted. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't wait for her to finish. He just laughed. A sharp, scoffing sound that echoed across the chamber like a slap. "Forgive me," he said, leaning forward with a smirk. "But is this a budget hearing or a campaign commercial?" A few chuckles broke out among the gallery. Cameras zoomed in. Schiff wasn't done. "It's always touching when we invoke children," he said, his tone syrupy and smug. "But I'd like to remind Ms. Leavitt that anecdotes while moving don't balance federal ledgers. We need facts, not funeral stories." A few staffers near the back grinned. Someone stifled a laugh. Karoline didn't move, didn't blink. She slowly exhaled, closed her eyes for just 2 seconds, and opened them again. No one in the room said a word. The camera found her face calm, resolute. Her hands remained folded on the table. She didn't respond. Not yet. And that silence in that moment spoke louder than anything else. It wasn't defiance. It was something deeper. Not a fight, a reckoning. Because what no one knew yet, what Adam Schiff was about to learn the hard way, was that Karoline Leavitt had not come to play politics. She had come to lay something on the table that would shake Capitol Hill to its core, and the quiet before that moment that was the last time Adam Schiff would ever smirk in that hearing room. The silence didn't last long. Karoline Leavitt had barely finished her first remarks when Senator Adam Schiff seized the moment again. He didn't wait for her to continue. He didn't acknowledge the case she had brought forward. Instead, he leaned in elbows on the polished desk and raised his voice just enough to let the cameras hear what he wanted America to believe. "Ms. Leavitt," he said with that unmistakable tone of superiority, "you're not a physician. You're not a public health expert. You're a press secretary, a media personality." He gestured toward her as if unveiling a circus act, and quite frankly, one who enjoys telling emotional stories more than presenting policy. His words hit hard and purposefully. The message was clear: this wasn't a place for empathy. This was math, budget lines, columns and rows. The Senate wasn't interested in tears or photographs. There was an audible shift in the room. A few senators nodded slightly. A soft murmur broke out behind the press box. Schiff had done this before many times. He knew how to turn sentiment into spectacle, then swat it down like a nuisance. And now he was putting Karoline on trial not for what she said, but for who she was. Karoline said nothing. She could have answered. She could have pushed back. But instead she sat still as if waiting for the storm to finish circling before standing in the eye of it. Her expression remained neutral, but the tight grip on her pen betrayed the pressure building just beneath the surface. Schiff wasn't finished. He smiled tightly and leaned back in his chair as though settling into a well-rehearsed performance. "We've heard these kinds of stories before," he continued. Anecdotes about children in pain, about mothers crying in hallways, about communities left behind. But let me be clear, we don't craft federal healthcare policy on the backs of sentimentality. We make decisions based on data, cold, hard, evidence-backed data. He paused for effect, then delivered the blow. We don't govern based on photographs of children. We govern based on spreadsheets. That sentence landed like a slap. Even those in the room who agreed with Schiff felt a sting. The words were too harsh, too dismissive, too eager to win points rather than find truth. Karoline looked down for a brief moment. It was the first visible movement she had made since Schiff began his attack. A flicker of thought crossed her face, but she said nothing. Again, not yet. Across the room in the public gallery, a young man sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands tightly clutched around a photograph. His name was Zion Dorsey, and if the senators had looked just a little higher above their microphones, they would have seen his face locked in a quiet war between rage and restraint. The photo in his hands was worn around the edges, creased from folding. He'd held it for months. It showed his sister Maya Dorsey in a pink jacket with one mitten missing, smiling in front of the town's only medical clinic in Gray Hill, Ohio. That clinic had shut down the week before her asthma attack. The ambulance had never arrived. Maya died in his arms. Zion didn't come to speak. He came to watch, to bear witness. But as Schiff's words poured out, arrogant, sterile, sanitized of any humanity, Zion's knuckles turned white. Around the frame of the photo, back on the floor, a few senators shifted uncomfortably. Chairwoman Grace Monroe cleared her throat once, then again. Senator Daniel Brooks shook his head subtly. He didn't speak, but his expression said enough. This had gone too far. Schiff didn't seem to notice or care. "We've become far too comfortable," he continued, allowing emotional manipulation to masquerade as policy advocacy. "We're not here to be moved. We're here to govern." He glanced at Karoline with that same condescension he'd worn from the moment she walked in. "Stories don't save lives, Ms. Leavitt. Systems do." For a moment the room felt colder and quieter. Karoline looked straight ahead. Her hands were still, but her eyes weren't. They moved carefully first toward the gallery where Zion sat holding that photo like it was the last thing he had left, then back to Schiff. There was no anger in her expression, no sarcasm, just clarity. She opened her folder slowly, revealing nothing. Not yet. She didn't speak. That perhaps is what unsettled the room the most, because Schiff had thrown every verbal punch he could muster, expecting resistance, expecting a fight, perhaps even a flustered rebuttal he could tear apart. But Karoline offered none of it. She didn't give him the satisfaction of outrage. She didn't meet his attacks with noise. She met them with silence, with patience, with control, and somewhere deep inside that quiet Schiff realized something was coming, something he didn't see, something not in the spreadsheets. Because he could mock her position, he could question her credentials, he could try to turn a tragedy into political theater. But what he couldn't do, what he had underestimated entirely, was what happened when the people watching realized this wasn't just a policy debate. It was a reckoning. And Karoline Leavitt hadn't even stood up yet. The air inside the Senate hearing room had shifted. After Adam Schiff's dismissive tirade, after his sterile indictment of emotion, after his scoffing at photographs of children, everyone waited to see how Karoline Leavitt would respond. She didn't reach for data. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she reached into her leather folder slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a single unassuming envelope. No markings, no logos, just a thick white envelope, the kind people use to carry things too personal for email. Karoline held it for a moment, her fingers resting gently on its seal. Then she opened it. From it, she withdrew a photograph, an 8x10 print-heavy matte paper. The kind that doesn't bend easily. She held it up not to the cameras, not to the senators, but to the American people watching at home through the silent lenses of broadcast television. She spoke only 7 words. Data didn't save Maya Dorsey's life. The room stilled. Even Schiff's habitual pen tapping stopped. Karoline didn't rush. She held the photo chest high, then slowly laid it face up on the table in front of her, turning it outward so everyone, senators, aides, reporters, and the nation beyond, could see it clearly. The image was raw, untouched, and devastating. It showed a young girl, dark-skinned, no older than 9, lying on a makeshift stretcher in the back of a pickup truck. Her body was partially wrapped in a faded green farm blanket. One arm dangled limply at her side. Her face was pale lips, blue eyes closed. In the background, a closed clinic chain locked and lifeless. Her name, Karoline confirmed, was Maya Dorsey. She had died on her front lawn in Gray Hill, Ohio. The ambulance never came. Karoline didn't blink. She looked directly at Senator Schiff. Her voice stayed calm, her tone even. Maya had asthma. Her mother called 911 3 times. The nearest operating ambulance was 41 miles away. They'd all been rerouted, not because of a natural disaster, not because of traffic, but because of a budget freeze, a freeze initiated by your office. Now the hearing room truly fell silent. Not respectful silence, gutted silence. The kind that creeps in when something sacred has just been violated. Karoline let the words hang. She didn't embellish. She didn't editorialize. She just let the truth sit cold and undeniable. From the gallery, Zion Dorsey stood up. He said nothing. He didn't move forward. He simply stood tall, heartbroken, holding the same photo now seen on the Senate table. Karoline glanced toward him. Her voice softened but didn't waver. Zion is Maya's brother. He was the one who carried her body to that pickup truck, because there was no other way to get help. Schiff didn't speak. He shifted slightly in his seat, eyes darting across the room, then downward. But Karoline wasn't finished. We are not here to be entertained. We are not here to trade sound bites, but let's be very clear. This, she tapped the photo gently, is what policy looks like. When decisions are made behind closed doors without facing the consequences, children die. Not symbolically, not statistically, literally. Gasps weren't needed. The silence said more than any outcry ever could. The camera zoomed in on the photo again, then to Schiff's face frozen, then to Karoline calm, unmoving. Chairwoman Grace Monroe slowly leaned forward, visibly shaken. Her hands clasped together, lips pressed tightly. For once, even the press pool stopped typing. Karoline continued, not louder, not angrier, but with a precision that struck deeper than anger ever could. You said we don't govern by photographs, that we govern by spreadsheets. But Senator, let me ask you, how many dead children need to fit in a spreadsheet before it counts as truth? Schiff still said nothing. A whisper rippled through the chamber, not from the officials, but from the observation gallery. An elderly woman clasped her rosary. A man in military uniform lowered his eyes. Zion remained standing, his face hollow with memory. Karoline stood now, not in outrage, but in reverence. She gently picked up the photo and held it to her chest, not as a prop, but as if holding a piece of the country that had been lost and forgotten. I didn't come here to cry. I came here because Maya deserves to be remembered. Because this hearing, this moment, is not just about money. It's about whether Washington still sees the people it claims to represent. She paused, letting that final sentence breathe. Senator Schiff, your office may have frozen the funding, but you also froze the hope of families like the Dorseys who trusted that government would be there in their darkest hour. You failed them, and you owe them more than a smirk. The blow didn't need to be raised. It had already landed. Karoline stepped back. Her voice dropped one final octave, almost a whisper. Her name was Maya, not a line item. Not a percentage, a little girl who deserved better. She sat down. No further words, no need. And for the first time that morning, Adam Schiff looked afraid, not of Karoline, but of the truth she had just unleashed. Because it wasn't just a photo, it was a mirror, and everyone in that room had just seen their own reflection. The silence that followed the photograph was deafening. No one moved, no one dared speak. Karoline Leavitt had just held up a mirror, and every person in that room saw something they hadn't expected: accountability staring back. But Karoline wasn't finished, not even close. While Schiff sat frozen, unsure of how to respond to the image of a lifeless child wrapped in a farm blanket, Karoline calmly reached into her folder again. This time there were no photos, no sentiment, only paper, official, dated and stamped. Her voice didn't rise, but her words cut sharper than ever. For those asking whether this was just an unfortunate coincidence, I want to be very clear. I have documentation, internal emails from Senator Schiff's office instructing staff to delay rural ambulance funding. Quote, until the election atmosphere in District 12 stabilizes. Gasps, audible this time. Karoline held up the printout, bold red text highlighted across the top. These aren't theories, they're communications, deliberate, strategic, calculated, and they cost Maya Dorsey her life. Schiff jolted to his feet. This is absurd, he barked, voice cracking. This is political theater, a setup. That document has no legal standing. The room tensed. Schiff's face flushed red, his words stumbling over one another as he gestured wildly. But Karoline remained still. She let him unravel, let the cameras catch every twitch, every stammer. He didn't notice that while he shouted, Karoline had already stepped forward. Without saying a word, she walked toward Chairwoman Grace Monroe and extended a red folder. The senator, composed and stone-faced, accepted it. Inside the smoking gun. The contents were precise and devastating. Email chains from Schiff's senior staff to regional funding directors with timestamps matching the days rural funds were frozen. A memorandum of fiscal intent signed by Schiff's deputy chief of staff explicitly stating, postpone release of funds to Region 12 until post-November polling data confirms stability. A budget allocation map color-coded, clearly labeling freeze zones in red, most of them rural counties with high uninsured rates and poor infrastructure. Gray Hill, Ohio was marked in bold. Chairwoman Monroe opened the folder slowly. She read the first page, then the second. Her brow furrowed. Her mouth drew into a tight line. The camera zoomed in on her hands as she turned the pages, not a tremble, just methodical reading. Across the room, Schiff shifted in his chair. He glanced sideways at his aides, all of whom were now visibly panicking, scrolling their phones, avoiding eye contact, whispering behind tablets. Karoline returned to her seat, composed, her hands folded again on the table. The press box went into overdrive, fingers slammed keyboards, phones buzzed, live streams ticked upward by the tens of thousands. Every major network flipped from routine hearing to breaking news. For the first time, the narrative had reversed. Karoline wasn't a target anymore. She was the one holding the match, and the documents were dry timber. Chairwoman Monroe finally spoke. Ms. Levitt, are these materials verified? Karoline nodded. They were obtained through a legal faux IA request filed 6 months ago. The full chain has been time-stamped and matched with Treasury movement logs. Schiff stood again, but this time slower. He didn't shout. His voice had dropped an octave quieter, more uncertain. Even if there was a delay, he said, eyes darting, you can't attribute one tragedy to a national funding strategy. It's irresponsible. You're exploiting a death for political gain. Karoline didn't respond to him directly. Instead, she turned to Chairwoman Monroe. With respect, Madam Chair, I believe the committee deserves to view the evidence in full. Monroe nodded once, handed the red folder to her clerk, and said flatly, enter it into record. The clerk rose, placed the documents into the official record binder, and passed them down the line. As the folder moved from senator to senator, the expressions changed from curiosity to disbelief to something darker, disgust. Senator Daniel Brooks was next to receive it. He flipped through the top few pages, jaw tightening. He looked up at Schiff, then at Karoline, and back at the folder. If this is real, he said slowly, we're not looking at a mistake. We're looking at deliberate obstruction with political intent. Schiff scoffed, but the sound rang hollow. He reached for his water glass, missed, slightly corrected, drank too fast. His hands were visibly shaking. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't smile. Her voice, when she finally spoke again, was even softer than before. I didn't bring these to humiliate anyone. I brought them because someone had to speak for the people who couldn't get an ambulance when it mattered most. For the people whose names never make it into your strategy sessions. Then a beat of silence. This isn't politics, this is life and death. And no election is worth the life of a child. That was the moment something shifted, not just in the room, but across the country. It wasn't just the press that noticed. It wasn't just staffers texting frantically or TV anchors rushing back to studio. It was veterans in VFW halls, mothers in laundromats, retirees sipping coffee in Midwest diners hearing the words echo through Fox, CNN, Newsmax all at once. A rural EMT in Kansas named Rick texted his wife. Someone finally said it. And in Gray Hill, Ohio, at a small flower shop across from the shuttered clinic, Maya Dorsey's mother, Angela, put down her work and just stared at the screen. She said nothing, but she wept because someone in Washington had finally stopped talking numbers and started talking truth. Just when it seemed the hearing couldn't get any heavier, it did. The evidence Karoline Leavitt had just submitted, emails, fiscal memos, budget maps, was still making its way through the Senate dais, turning the air dense with tension. Chairwoman Monroe was visibly shaken. Adam Schiff had grown pale and unusually quiet. His staffers whispered behind him, heads down, phones buzzing nonstop. The room had already absorbed more truth than it was prepared to handle. And then another voice rose, not from the Senate floor, not from a politician, but from the gallery. A woman stood up. She wasn't a staffer, wasn't a protester, wasn't there for show. She stood with a quiet dignity that instantly commanded attention. Her name was Dr. Lena Rivera. Her white blouse was wrinkled from the long mourning. Her hospital badge still hung around her neck. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud, but it pierced the chamber with unshakable clarity. "I am the attending physician at Gray Hill Clinic." Karoline turned slowly. Schiff looked up, startled. Dr. Rivera didn't ask permission to speak. She didn't need to. The entire room, cameras, senators, citizens, locked onto her. "I was the one who tried to resuscitate Maya Dorsey." There was a sharp intake of breath. Someone in the back dropped a pen. Dr. Rivera's eyes didn't blink. She stared forward, speaking as one who had carried this burden too long in silence. "I called the emergency dispatch line 4 times. 4. Each time the system routed us elsewhere, places with no active units. Our funding had been suspended. Our only ambulance had been relocated to a neighboring district. We had no backup, no transport, nothing." She swallowed hard, but didn't stop. Maya arrived in her brother's arms. We placed her on the floor. I tried everything, oxygen, chest compressions. But at 9:42 a.m., I pronounced her dead. Her voice cracked slightly. Then she steadied again. She was 9, her lungs had a chance, but her district didn't. The room went silent once more, not out of shock, but out of shame. The camera turned to Schiff. His face had gone from flushed to chalk white. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Across the gallery, Zion Dorsey, Maya's older brother, stood too, but not to speak. He reached into his pocket and held up something small, delicate, and unmistakably personal. A frayed pink friendship bracelet. It dangled from his fingers, faded and broken, one end snapped as if torn in panic. It had been Maya's. Zion didn't make a speech. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood silent, holding the bracelet up for every senator to see. No sound. Just a single broken loop of yarn and plastic beads, what was left of a sister who had trusted the system to protect her. The bracelet swayed slightly in the still air, a simple but searing indictment of every excuse that had been made before this day. Karoline closed her eyes briefly. Even Chairwoman Monroe looked down, her fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of her desk. Dr. Rivera spoke one last time. "If we had just one ambulance, just one, we would have gotten her to a trauma center within 20 minutes. But because of that funding freeze, Maya didn't even get a chance." She paused, then looked directly at Schiff. "She didn't die from asthma, Senator. She died from neglect, from red tape, from political decisions made in rooms like this. It was the statement no one could refute. And Schiff knew it." His hands resting on the table now trembled visibly. He reached for a glass of water but missed the stem on the first try. When he finally took a sip, it did little to steady him. Hearing had already slipped out of his control. He had been the accuser at the start of the morning. Now he sat silently, the accused, while outside that chamber Americans were beginning to watch in stunned slants. In nursing homes from Ohio to Oklahoma, in break rooms, truck stops, and living rooms. People watched a woman doctor stand up, not for politics, not for points, but for truth. Raw, undeniable, and for the first time in years, many felt something strange return. Not anger, not cynicism, but belief that maybe, just maybe, someone was finally listening. After Dr. Lena Rivera finished speaking and Zion Dorsey lowered the broken pink bracelet, there were no more accusations, no more grandstanding. The hearing room had gone from political battleground to sacred ground. Something weightier than legislation was happening. This wasn't about policy anymore, it was about conscience. Karoline Leavitt didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, she stood up from her chair and faced the Senate committee. Her posture straight, her face composed, and did something no one expected. She said nothing. She simply stood there. No words, no gestures, no slogans, just silence. For 1 full minute, Karoline remained still, her hands at her sides, her eyes steady, her presence unmistakable. In that moment, the noise of politics evaporated. The cameras continued rolling, but no one dared cut away. No one looked at their phones, no aide whispered. No senator shifted in their seat. Time slowed. Senator Daniel Brooks bowed his head, one hand over his eyes. From the back row, a soft sob slipped out, barely audible but deeply human, the kind of sound that couldn't be staged. Chairwoman Monroe, still holding the red folder of evidence, let her hands rest in her lap and didn't blink. America watched, and more importantly, America felt it. Across the country, that 1 minute of silence broke through walls. In Alabama, a truck driver named Rick Nash pulled his rig to the side of a country highway and started a live stream with shaking hands. With the sun cutting through his windshield, he whispered. She didn't yell. She just stood there. She showed a picture, and the whole country stopped moving. In Oregon, in a second-grade classroom, a teacher named Jillian May played the clip for her students during civics hour. An 8-year-old girl with braided pigtails raised her hand and asked, "If Karoline didn't help Maya, then who would have?" The teacher didn't have an answer. In a church basement in Ohio, a group of Vietnam veterans gathered around a small TV, eyes misty caps in their laps. One of them, a man named George, turned to his buddy and muttered, "That girl, she's not playing games. She's carrying something." At a diner in Nebraska, waitresses stopped taking orders. A cook leaned out from the kitchen. A table of farmers watched with hats off, one of them whispering, "This isn't Washington politics. This is something else." For once, silence didn't mean nothing was happening. It meant everything was. Karoline didn't break the silence with a speech. She simply looked around the room at Schiff, at the senators, at the American people behind the cameras, and then sat down. Quiet, measured, resolute. She wasn't there to destroy anyone. She was there to honor someone. And the minute of silence became the most powerful statement of the day. Outside the Capitol, crowds that had gathered began standing still, some placing their hands on their hearts, others quietly wiping tears. There were no chants, no shouting, just faces, real people, united not by party but by truth. Across the airwaves, anchors lowered their voices, commentators stopped mid-sentence. Even rival networks like MSNBC and Fox News shared the clip unedited, uninterrupted. The headline everywhere was the same: "She stood silent and America listened." And at that moment, a nation built on words remembered the power of stillness. Not as absence, but as reverence. Because when Karoline Leavitt stood in silence for Maya Dorsey, she wasn't just remembering a little girl. She was restoring something far greater. She was reminding America what it means to care. The moment Karoline Leavitt sat down after her 1-minute silence, the hearing room felt different. No voices rose to reclaim control. No political points were scored. Even the marble walls seemed to absorb the weight of what had just happened. The silence lingered like sacred ground, too heavy to walk over, too meaningful to ignore. And then Chairwoman Grace Monroe cleared her throat. Her voice was low, measured. "In light of the evidence presented, both written and sworn, we are declaring an emergency review by the Senate Ethics Committee into the actions of Senator Adam Schiff." The sentence landed like thunder. Gasps swept through the observation gallery. Reporters' hands flew to keyboards, every news ticker across the country lit up in unison. But Schiff didn't wait. He didn't even try to respond. He stood up, quietly gathered his folder with trembling hands, and walked out of the hearing room without a word. His exit wasn't broadcast as a retreat, but it felt like one. His chair remained empty, stiff, symbolic, abandoned. Karoline didn't look after him. Her eyes stayed focused on something far more important. Zion. Still seated near the back, the boy who had lost his sister had remained still through it all. Stoic, unblinking, with the frayed pink bracelet still clutched in his hand. Karoline rose from her seat and stepped toward him slowly, carefully, not as a political figure, but as a human being. She knelt beside him and held out the photograph of Maya, the one she had placed on the Senate table, the one that had turned the tide of an entire hearing. Her words were quiet. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore. I've done my part, and now your sister won't be forgotten." Zion didn't speak. He didn't have to. He just nodded once, tears pooling in his eyes. For the first time that day, he looked like a child again. Not a witness, not a symbol, just a brother grieving someone he loved. Karoline gave the photo back and stood. She didn't wait for applause. There was none. Just reverence. That evening, after the hearing recessed and the headlines exploded, Karoline didn't go on cable news. She didn't hold a press conference or tweet a soundbite. She returned to her small Capitol office, turned off the lights, and sat alone in the quiet. She wasn't seeking victory. What she had come for was truth, and it had finally been spoken. That's when she saw the envelope. It had no return address, just her name written in large, shaky print with a purple crayon. Tucked into the pile of correspondence from the day's chaos, it stood out like a whisper among shouts. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter handwritten on lined paper, slightly wrinkled, dotted with stars. "Dear Miss Karoline, my name is Lila. I'm 7. I live in Kansas. I saw you on TV today. My mom said you are very brave. I think so too. I want to be like you when I grow up. I want to help kids like Maya when no one else helps them. Thank you for being kind and strong and for standing still so the world could listen. Love." Lila. Karoline placed the letter on her desk. She didn't read it twice. She didn't file it away. She taped it to the top corner of her workspace, right where the sunlight would hit it every morning. Then she leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. No TV, no interviews, no celebration. Just silence again, a different kind this time. The kind that follows a promise kept. The kind that doesn't seek cameras but holds sacred the weight of what was done. "No one gets left behind," she whispered to the room, to the country, to herself. Not in Gray Hill, not anywhere. That night across America, the headlines were loud, but the meaning was quiet. In living rooms and coffee shops, people talked less about politics and more about presence. Not the kind on ballots, but the kind that stands when others shrink. The kind that listens when others dismiss. The kind that speaks with stillness. In Kansas, Lila went to bed early, her purple crayon beside her pillow. In Ohio, Angela Dorsey, Maya's mother, held her daughter's photo close, knowing her name had been spoken on the Senate floor. And in Washington, a chair sat empty, while across the hall a young woman sat in darkness, not out of defeat, but out of peace, because when Karoline Leavitt stood that day, it wasn't just for Maya. It was for every child who had ever been invisible, for every mother who cried unheard, for every voice too small to echo until someone stood still enough to carry it. In an age of noise, sometimes silence speaks the loudest. Karoline Leavitt didn't raise her voice. She didn't throw blame. She stood up, held a photo of a lost child, and let a minute of stillness shake the foundations of power. That moment reminds us that dignity, truth, and quiet conviction can cut deeper than any argument. For those of us who've lived through decades of change wars, recessions, protests, and political promises, we know something younger generations are still learning. Character isn't shown when cameras are rolling, but when you choose principle over applause. This story isn't just about Congress, it's about us as Americans, as grandparents, as people who still believe one honest voice can ripple across the country. Whether you're from Gray Hill, Ohio, or a small town in Montana, no one deserves to be forgotten. So let's remember, standing firm in what's right doesn't require volume, just courage. If this message moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed a moment where silence changed everything? Let us know below, and don't forget to hit subscribe to follow stories that still believe in the better side of America.